I believe in things like a strong parliament that holds the executive to account. I believe in checks and balances. I believe in holding those who have power at whatever level, that they should be accountable to the people. I believe in decentralisation of power, a strong, vibrant civil society. It feels process-driven. It feels an obsession with how we do things rather than the substance of the things that we feel really passionate about and the issues that we feel we get agitated over. People died for the vote. You can't see many people throwing themselves in front of a horse or a motor car in favour of stronger select committees. But I don't argue for democratic reform, and it's been the basis of most of the work I've done as an adult, because I believe in a beautiful process. I don't argue for it and I don't campaign around it because I just think it's the right way of doing things. I believe in it because I think unless the structures of our democracy work, and work for us, the people, we can't get good decision-making on those things, on the issues that we really are passionate about. We should never believe, and I say this very strongly, in democratic reform as an end in itself. And it will allow us, I believe, especially in the coming years, to deal with the bigger challenges we face as a country and as a planet better, issues like climate change, poor education, and our broken society. Now, there were some figures out last week, both by the Hansard Society and from the Electoral Commission, which I think are incredibly worrying in the run-up to this next election. 3 out of 4 people distrust politicians. There is this really strong sense, encouraged by the expenses scandal, that our politics just isn't delivering and it isn't working. And I think even more, it's the system itself which is being brought to question. We have a democracy at the moment where the barriers to entry are high and they're getting higher, where engagement is low and it's getting lower, and where the main parties attract fewer and fewer of us and yet are accruing more and more power to us. Someone said to me the other day, you know, you over-egg this, you talk about crises. I don't use these words lightly. And they say, what crisis? In the end, people will vote, we will have a government and we will carry on. And I think that's the crisis, that they think we'll all go out, we will vote, and things will just carry on. Now, Power 2010 is a campaign that grew out of a report that I was involved with 2 or 3 years ago called the Power Inquiry, where we tried to take on, as an intellectual exercise, the issues around voter apathy, why people didn't vote, and to try and come up with a series of reforms or recommendations to say there are things that we can do about this. And there was 30 recommendations, and some people called it a blueprint for British democracy. We thought it was the beginning of an engagement, of a discussion around British democracy. Gordon Brown wrote a green paper based on our report. David Cameron, who was the new leader, decided that giving power away was going to be his big thing. But nothing happened. Off the back of the expenses scandal, there was a sense that there was an opportunity to raise some of these issues again, and our funding trust, the Roundtree Trust, asked us to put together a campaign to try and make the issues of democratic reform one of the issues, one of the deciding issues in this forthcoming election. So rather than saying, oh, there was 12 people and they went around the country and they came out with these reforms and we're now going to campaign on those reforms, we went right back to the beginning and we started talking to people all around the country, involved in all sorts of different groups, about what reforms they wanted to see. What were the priorities for them? We had something like 4,500 submissions. They were then put to a deliberative forum, so we took a cross-section of the UK population, and over a weekend they deliberated and they talked and they drew in experts, and they came out with a short list of reforms which were then put to a public vote. And 100,000 votes later, we got something we're calling the Power 2010 Pledge, which outlines 5 reforms. And they are introducing PR for Westminster elections, no ID cards and rolling back the database state, a fully elected second chamber, English votes for English laws, and a written constitution. And what we're saying to people is join us and take these reforms, take this pledge to the people that want to represent you at the next election. Take them to the candidates and quiz them on where they stand on these issues. A reforming Parliament has to be the thing that we're fighting for. But the conversations have to start now and they have to go on way after that Parliament sits. Our democracy isn't good enough and it's within our hands to change it. Thank you.
For me, the worst thing about the MP's expenses scandal was that it seemed to confirm in people's minds their worst fears and suspicions about politicians. It was almost like people had always suspected they were only in it for themselves, and they'd always had their snout in the trough. And then suddenly, writ large, in national newspapers, on TV screens, people suddenly had their worst fears confirmed. And of course, amidst all the furore around pensions and the deserved backlash which politicians have had, there are also the MPs who didn't abuse the system and have always acted with integrity and work incredibly hard, whose profession and whose passion and commitment and name has been dragged through the mud. But at this election, probably more than ever, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that politics doesn't matter, it doesn't make a difference, why vote anyway, let's disengage, they're all the same, and let's not even bother to cast our vote, because I believe that politics does make a difference. We could have a debate about the last 13 years alone, but I would still argue that there are many ways in which our country is better after 13 years of this government than would have been had someone else been in. People from the right will look at their history in government and argue that politics makes a difference. And, you know, like or loathe, who could argue that Thatcher didn't make a difference during her years in power? And my argument and my concern is that when people don't turn out and vote, it's ultimately the people themselves who lose. And let's just think for a moment at this election about who stands to lose if we continue to propagate and promote the idea that politics doesn't matter and make a difference. There are already significant sections of our politicians who don't turn out and use their vote. I represent a significant number of them. Students don't use their vote. Young people don't use their vote. But it's not just students and young people. In fact, I'm sometimes less concerned about students and young people, which might be a funny thing for the President of NUS to say, because when I think about the wider voting trends, there are lots of people who don't vote in this country who are working class and who need a government to act in their interests more than most, who need the state as a leveller, as an enabler, as a platform to help them to realise their aspirations and potential and to give them opportunity, who just don't turn out. So voting is a class-based issue. There are also significant sections of the population from black and other ethnic minority communities who also don't use their vote as well. So this is a racial issue, this is a class issue, voting is an equalities issue. I think the danger of politics over the last couple of decades is that ideology has seemed to not matter anymore. It's not about, we're in a post-ideological age. And when you think about the economic crisis and how we respond, when you think about the debate about how to promote greater equality, when you think about how to create social justice, natural justice, these are ideological issues, these are political issues. And I want a political system where politicians stand up and set out differing platforms. Let's have a real ideological debate. Let's see Gordon Brown and David Cameron and Nick Clegg in those leaders' debates setting out different ideological stalls and visions. But even better, let's set them out ourselves as people. In this country, we get the politicians and the politics we deserve. If we don't turn out and vote, if we don't engage, when people knock on our doors to canvass, if we don't talk to those people, if we don't have meetings like this, and if we say that politics doesn't matter and they're all the same, then that is the kind of political system that we bring on ourselves. So at this election, more than ever, ideology has to be central, the battle of ideas has to be central, but we will only get that debate if we, the people, demand it, because this election is ultimately about us, not the politicians, and we need to see ourselves as central to healing the political system and getting the kind of political system, but also the kind of country that we want and we deserve.
I think that almost everybody here will agree that politics has become exhausted. We face a powerful mood of cynicism, and I've never encountered an era in my long life where so many people have been switched off from virtually every dimension of public experience, not just voting, but just about anything that you can imagine, to the point at which even political activists who have given their life to politics have got no hesitation about resigning from the cabinet a couple of weeks before an election. When you just think about it, someone like James Purnell, who's been involved in politics all his life, decides, well, that's cool, I don't think I'll be a cabinet minister anymore, because actually it doesn't really matter. And that's the message that he was really saying, as well as all these different MPs. And I think there's a number of reasons why this is. But the most important problem that we're confronted with is that in Western societies, but in British society in particular, we lost the meaning of understanding what politics really means. We use politics in a very promiscuous way. We talk about the politics of food, we talk about sexual politics, we talk about the politics of health, and it really becomes an affectation in the way that we're using it. Everything becomes politics. And of course, when everything becomes politics, it's nothing. It doesn't really mean anything. And I think it's useful to recall what politics actually meant historically. when it emerged as a distinct form of inquiry and engagement in the city-states of ancient Greece, where politics was seen as providing the answer, or at least the potential for providing the answer, about the nature of rule, about the nature of the obligation that people had towards each other, about the meaning of what a citizen is, what the role of an individual was in relation to the wider community, and what kind of values had to be communicated to society and fought for if that was to work. And that's how ideas about democracy and all these things emerge. And if you want a very simple definition, historically, what politics really means, it simply means a refusal to defer to fate. A refusal to defer to fate. A refusal to accept the world as it is. What politics is really all about is the idea that we have choices. We've got the capacity to make choices. We've got the potential for making historical transformations in our lives. We may well have different ideas what we want to choose, but politics is not about food, it's not about sex, it's not about trade, it's not about all these things. It's about a relationship that you as an individual have towards the rest of society. And I think that ideal of politics has been lost. It's been lost in two ways. We no longer have the ideal of a citizen. We have a caricature of a citizen, but nor do we have political leaders. I mean, if you look at our political leadership, and Britain is a very interesting example, almost all of our leaders, especially the new cohorts going into Parliament, have never lived. I mean, they are literally people who've graduated from Oxford, gone into Parliament as parliamentary researchers, might have done a stint in a trade union as a researcher or something else. If they're Tory, they might also have got a job in a public relations company to work for a while. And then they get selected into Parliament. But, you know, they never lived. They're not like the old Labour MPs who struggled, who were trade unionists, who engaged with everyday reality, knew what poverty was. Nor are they even like some of those old conservative reactionaries who made their own businesses, who kind of did all the stuff that capitalists do. I don't know exactly what it is, but at least they've known what it was that they had to kind of confront. They were people of the world. You know, what we're left with now are literally the James Purnells of this world. Graduates from Oxford, goes into IPPR to work in a think tank, then becomes a researcher in the cabinet office, then gets selected into a seat, a safe seat, gets elected, joins the cabinet at a very young age. That's the kind of trajectory that we have. People who really, you know, don't know their ass from their elbow. And when they actually meet ordinary human beings, aren't exactly effective communicators. And that's, you know, when you have those kinds of politicians, there's no point in blaming them, right? I mean, there's absolutely no, any more than you would blame your child for stumbling on the road or crossing the lights when it's red instead of green. That's what kids are like. That's what they are like. There's no point really in blaming them. And I think that would merely lead to being very encouraging cynicism and not understanding the more kind of profound issues that exist. What I want to argue is that we actually live in a pre-political era. We live in an era where politics cannot have any meaning, and therefore our job as Democrats is to restore the meaning of politics. It means, first of all, a commitment to reposing the political issues, the questions that really do matter for a real creation of a real public. You see, one of the most disheartening things in British politics, as we call it, is that almost all the issues are defined or conspicuously narrow and shallow in their definition. I mean, Wes mentioned the MP's expenses issue, which isn't just simply boring, but the very fact that it's become a subject of debate, that we now discover that MPs do what they've done over the last 2 centuries, and we're kind of surprised by that, and becomes a subject of debate, is as interesting as we now discovered that bankers are greedy. You know, major discovery, sort of never knew it before. They like big bonuses. Okay, let's have a huge debate about bankers' bonuses for the next year, because we never knew that they had unearned bonuses. So all of a sudden, the kind of everyday commonplaces that people didn't even think about for centuries emerge as the key, sort of clinch issues of our time. And we get to the point where in the middle of a world global recession, where there are some very important decisions to be made about the nature of state expenditure, about the relationship between the public and the private sector, about welfare measures, how we're going to organize ourselves, about the future of both the national and the global economy. Well, where's the debate on all these things? Instead, what we have are both of the major parties denying or ignoring what needs to be done. The Conservatives know they're going to be doing all kinds of cuts and reductions in state expenditure, but really are very reluctant to spell out, what they would want to do. Labour is pretty much the same. Instead of indicating what the issues are, it's saying not now, later. Later we'll have a different kind of discussion. There's no real attempt to engage the public, to take the public seriously as grown-ups. And I think what that means is that it's really up to us to take ourselves seriously. And what I argue we need to do in the first instance is to, in a sense, take our relationship to the future, towards the making of history, in a much more upfront kind of a manner. We've got to understand that what we need to really kind of value and affirm is the capacity of individuals and of people to really alter their circumstances and not just be merely seen as kind of machine fodders for the political process as it now exists. And it's what I call in my books humanizing personhood, where we actually understand that in order to have a public life that's worthy of the name public life and politics, we do need to have a greater belief and capacity in the potential of human beings to act as agents of their destiny and to alter their circumstances. So we need to get back to the basic principles and repose issues in order to make politics relevant. What does that mean in practical sense? Very difficult question. I was in Sweden a couple of weeks ago, and somebody says, what would you do in this election, Frank? You got 30 seconds to give your answer, and that really concentrated the mind. It was very difficult. Maybe it's my mind. Maybe I can't concentrate anymore. But in the end, I could only come up with what I think is an answer that works for me. The first thing that I said was, my advice is, whatever you do, don't vote for New Labour. Right? New Labour represents corruption. It represents the worst practices of the last period. They are, in many ways, responsible for so much of what is so bad in our country. Don't vote for New Labour. Even if you have progressive, sort of future-oriented views, the first thing that we need to do to shake things up is not to vote for New Labour. Vote for people who really have some beliefs in something that they believe in that's more than just themselves, something that's a bit higher than that of being an individual sort of machine, sort of kind of character. Secondly, promote a future-oriented, progressive, liberal political culture. I do think that in the era that we live in, we need to have a political orientation that is very clearly oriented towards the future. This is a future that is different, that is better than what exists now. It's progressive in the sense that it doesn't harken back to the past and merely wants to relive the old traditions, but is also genuinely liberal in the 19th century sense of understanding the importance of individual rights, of individual choices, and understands the importance that individuals can have in order to create the wider forms of solidarity, public solidarity that we need in order to make politics a reality. So it seems to me that those are the three things that we should really run with in this election. Reject New Labour completely. They really got to be thrown out if things are going to be shaken up. Begin to repose the issues in a way that it makes sense to people, and really commit yourself to a future-oriented, progressive liberal culture that is so vital if you're going to get away from the politics of process, the politics of techniques and technocratic orientations, towards something that can really capture the moral and the spiritual sort of imagination of people out there. Thank you.
The fallacy, which is sort of peddled, I think, by politicians and political commentators, that the drop in voting turnout and what they see as the lack of interest which people, particularly young people, show in politics is because they're apathetic or because they're badly educated. Now, I mean, my view is that actually young people today are better educated and more knowledgeable than any group of young people in history. The problem is that what they're not interested in is party politics. They're not interested in the political machine. And when you talk to young people, or when you listen to young people, you realise they're actually passionately interested in politics with a small p. What they're interested in is the political issues. You know, they're interested in transport and obviously tuition fees, education. They're interested in the fact they can't get jobs. And if you say to them, are you interested in politics? They say, no. You know, what's politics ever done for us? And if you then do what we do in the book, is to say, these are all the things that politics has achieved. You can go back to abolition of slavery and votes for women or whatever, but you can deal with a lot of things that politics has done for good and bad in the last decade or two decades, and then suddenly people say, oh yeah, we're interested in those, but they don't see the connect between those issues which they are really interested in, which they're passionately interested in, and politics. I'm not absolving politicians from blame for this disconnect, but my view is that the media bears a great deal of the responsibility because of the way that it deals with politics. And it seemed to me that it's one of the reasons I've always been a political journalist, that one of the main functions of journalism and functions of the media was to make that connect between what happens in everyday life and between the political establishment. It's how people get their information. How much you hate the media, it is how people get their information, particularly in a modern society. But I think what's happened to the media in the last couple of decades, or most of the media, and I'm not talking just about newspapers here, is that they've pretty well given up reporting what I think of as politics and what, presumably, if you come to something called Battle of the Ideas, what you think of as politics. And I think the greatest offenders are not the red tops or the Daily Mail, which I can perhaps talk about later, but I think the broadsheets bear a huge amount of responsibility for it, and also BBC Television. Both of which have followed an agenda which I think trivialises politics, which deals with personality. I think if you want a lesson on how politics should be dealt with in the media, I think there's no better example than Radio 4. This is not an anti-BBC rant. If you look at Today programme, World at 1 p.m, The World Tonight, you see how politics can be reported in an intelligent and accessible way. I'm not saying they do everything perfectly, they don't, but at least if you listen to those programmes, then you get some sort of idea how politics could be done. I think the way that television news covers politics is almost always focused on personalities. It's almost always, and you can sometimes see the political reporters who do care on the whole about politics squirming when they're asked some sort of silly question, and it's so much their opinion and not what is actually going on and the important issues. Turning to the broadsheets. The broadsheets aren't totally trivial, but they have gone to a huge extent down the road of dealing with personalities. Of course they do some stories, some good analysis, but the fundamental way they deal with parliamentary politics is on the personalised and trivial way. And I remember, when I first started working down at Westminster, every newspaper, including not just the Daily Mirror, but all the red tops, and the Express and the Mail, we all had a gallery reporter, somebody who sat in the gallery and reported what went on in the chamber of the House of Commons. They've all gone long ago. What we have now is sketch writers. Now, lots of people find the sketch writers very amusing. I do myself. I read them and I have a good laugh. It doesn't tell you what is actually happening in the legislature. Finally, I'm going to say something about the Daily Telegraph and the expenses and allowances scandal. I think that they did an amazing job in reporting that. I don't agree with Frank where he says everyone knew about it. They didn't know about it because, of course, it hadn't been going on that long. But I'm sure I'm not the only person, certainly in this room, but outside, who doesn't feel a certain sense of uneasiness about the complete one-sided nature of the way that they've covered this story. The fact that they don't accept that there are a lot of MPs who do a very good job, who are very conscientious, and there really aren't many people who have ever gone into politics because they wanted to rip off the taxpayer, rip off their expenses, or make a lot of money. So finally, I would say that after May the 6th, the media will be leading the hand-wringing and saying, isn't it terrible the turnout was so low? Isn't it terrible the BNP's increased its votes by whatever? But in my opinion, it will be the media which bears a great measure of the responsibility for that. And I think that they and the journalists who in their day jobs trivialise the reporting of politics need to be challenged about it.
I think that there's a very honourable tradition of self-selected, highly motivated political engagement. In fact, if you look at the experience of human history, you don't have a situation where every woman gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to be a suffragette and I'm going to fight for women's equality. You begin with relatively small numbers of people who take that issue very seriously. And either through good luck or being very effective, they manage to influence the rest of society. And I do think that instead of being worried about self-selected and isolated, the question becomes not whether you or not you're self-selected, but to what extent you've got a contribution to make. To what extent are you open to new experience? To what extent have you developed ideas that are suitable for the early 21st century? Because if you have a kind of a more open-minded, flexible political orientation, then what you're also saying is that you've got a model of political development in mind that is based on history and may actually work. Let me explain what I mean by that. At the moment, everybody's trying to re-engage the people that cannot be engaged. I mean, the very concept of re-engagement is a contradiction in terms. You see, if you look at human history, working class people didn't wait for people to re-engage them. It wasn't the case that the door was open to them and said, please, trade unionists, organize a trade union. People kicked the door through and organized for themselves. At a certain moment, they realized that they wanted to enter the public stage. It wasn't like they were re-engaged or engaged. They understood that at that moment, in terms of their position in society, they had to do something in order to move forward. And what that really means, in a sense, is that instead of being worried about engaging with these amorphous people that are out there and trying to work at all these cute little tricks, by talking to people about what's in their interest, I mean, that's another myth. You've got to be very relevant. It's got to be about them. It doesn't. All the big movements in history are movements that were based on idealism. When I was a student, people marched on Vietnam, not because they were Vietnamese peasants, not because they grew up in Hanoi, but because they took the issue of a war thousands of miles away very, very seriously. And that's the way it's always happened. So the idea that we patronize people, these disengaged people, with these little ever so relevant, community-related things is just nonsense. So instead of being worried about re-engaging them, I think we have to be worried about the people that are in this room, the self-selected lot, and to see to what extent they can be effective, to what extent they can be effective public citizens that can use their influence to bear upon the political culture that's evolving at this particular stage in time. And I think that's really the direction that we should be moving in. And that is something that we need to discuss. And for example, are our ideas worthy of the name ideas? Are we effective enough? Is what we're saying clear enough? You see, is it going to make any kind of major difference? I do think that the glass is not only half not full; it's totally empty at the moment. And I do think, we really got to look at reality at face. There's never been an election that I've lived through where so many people are so far away from taking it seriously, where even the most committed, I talk to a lot of people in politics, and even people in parliament are so detached and estranged from their own experience that it's not at all surprising that the rest of the world is going through the motion. And I do think we have to take that on board and not live in class cuckoo land and imagine that it's actually that all these wonderful things are going out, that they just need to be discovered. That is really a fool's errand that we need to avoid.
Well, my greatest criticism of politicians is that I think they're cowardly. And I think that there are a whole range of the most important issues. I've written down law and order, immigration, Europe, care of the elderly, welfare, family breakdown, where they don't actually say what they believe is the best solution. Some of them say what they think is the best solution, but on the whole, they don't say it, not when they're in any position of power. In fact, you see what they really think when they stop being a minister or a shadow minister, and they then say the opposite of what they did when they were, Home Secretary or whatever. Drugs is another issue, very big issue. And I think that the reason why they do that is because the press says it, or because the Daily Mail says it, or whatever. The reason, because they think that's what they ought to be saying. But of course, ordinary people who have to live in the ordinary world, they realise it's nonsense. And so I think that there's a real lack. We talk about political ideas. There are no political ideas. What we have is political gimmicks coming out. New Labour is. Frank's had a big go at New Labour, so I shouldn't really add to their woes and miseries. But the fact of the matter is that on the whole, New Labour governs by gimmick. I think we are likely to see a Conservative government that governs by gimmick, because I don't think they will have the courage to do what Ian Duncan Smith and some of they've got a terribly liberal justice team, a really liberal justice team. I mean, they're so liberal, as I've said to them, they'd never get in the Labour Party. But they won't be allowed to do it. You know, we all saw what happened when Cameron said something like, we didn't actually say hugahudi, but that's how it was reported as. And they don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be attacked by the right-wing press. So they chicken out of it, and then they do things which don't help anybody. And that's why one of the reasons why we're so badly governed. And people realise that we're badly governed, and they realise the politicians don't have the courage to deal with what ordinary people see as the issues that face them.
This sort of relentless, sanctimonious moaning at people that they should vote. It doesn't matter who they vote for, just vote. Voting matters, the suffragettes, blah, 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 blah. It made me so cross at the last election because it seemed to me that these campaigns to just lecture on at people about voting as if it was just, the be-all and end-all of everything are actually entirely antithetical to the suffragettes, not least, but also to anything that I've ever taken to mean a serious interest in politics and society. And frankly, why should I vote for New Labour or indeed anybody else if I think everything that they stand for is entirely reprehensible? The second thing I wanted to comment on was this kind of discussion about young people and what young people think, because it was the other thing that made me feel very cross at the last election. I'm a university teacher. And my experience of young people and talking to them is that most of the time, and this isn't to do them down, my students, I really like most of them, but most of the time to get them to think about anything is extremely hard work. Because not only are they not interested in politics, but the things that have been mentioned from the platform as, the things that go on in their lives that they have got things to say about, are oftentimes, frankly, fairly banal. And they're not really things that are the substance of proper discussion about things that are going on more generally in society. And to get young people to think about things that are happening more generally in society and where they stand on things that really matter is frankly extremely hard work. And I think it's rather a sort of dereliction of duty, really, of people who are grown-up political people to just talk about young people in this way as if they're all marvellous and the things they think are all really interesting. I think most of the time they're not, and I think that we don't take ourselves very seriously, or them, if we carry on like that.
This is primarily to David Seymour. His introduction sort of reminded me when he was talking about going to school kids and telling them what politics is about and saying that this is what politics has done for you. Women have the vote, this is because of politics. Reminds me of the sketch from The Life of Brian where the People's Front of Judea are discussing what the Romans have done for them, and it turns out that it's quite an awful lot. This is of course, a bit of a satire of kind of malcontent political groupuscules, but in fact I'm kind of sympathetic with them because ultimately what the answer there is, which is not voiced in the film, is that what they want is self-determination. No matter what the Romans have done for them, I think they want to determine for themselves what their own future is. But I think the way that David Seymour kind of described the problems with politics today kind of gets things the wrong way around. Because the question today is not what politics may have done for you, but really what we want for ourselves, and I think that's not what's not discussed. And I think that's evident in the critique of the media. Though I do recognise some of what David Seymour said in his critique of the media, I think that gets a problem the wrong way around, because it's not just a communicative problem that we aren't informed enough about what is happening in Parliament, or that it's discussed on a too superficial level, which of course it is. It's not purely just a communication problem. I think that's symptomatic of a political culture which doesn't take itself seriously. So to purely discuss on the level of media and as a communication problem that we are not told enough about what politics can do for us, I think it's things the wrong way around. The real question is what we want for ourselves.
If the reason that people vote because all they want to do is what they want for themselves, I mean, we're into real Thatcher territory there. And the idea that society can progress in any way at all, if when you go to vote, you only vote because you think you're going to get a penny off in your income tax, or I don't know, you're going to get £150 for being married if you vote Conservative. Young people, by the way, I agree, I'm not saying all young people are absolutely enthused by politics. I know that's not true, but I do think there are an awful lot of them, and I think that needs to be encouraged. The problem is with democratic politics. Now, it is true that not just that the media filters the political messages that come out, but that politicians, this is the other side of it, politicians do not, what was the one policy that Tony Blair's government had between 1997 and 2001? It was to get re-elected. That was it. And so much, the reason that we're governed by gimmick is that the first thing they think when they wake up in the morning and the last thing they think before they go to bed at night is what can we do to get re-elected? And that is not the way to govern a country. It means you do the wrong things, you do the short-term things, you avoid doing dealing with the really big issues which have got a long-term consequence. Now, so I'm not speaking out against democratic politics, but I will say one thing which doubtless lots and lots of people will disagree with me. Pam looked aghast when I said it to her the other day, which is that there's all this talk once again about making the House of Lords completely elected, but actually you get much more sense from people in the House of Lords who don't have to worry about facing the ballot box every 4 or 5 years. And I would like to see, and I do think it's a really big issue, is that I would like to see all the political parties look at how you get the best out of the political system, how you get the best out of the democratic system, which doesn't mean that everything politicians do is governed by how the voters are going to behave at the next election.
When it comes to voting, what I'm arguing for is, look around. There are people, even in the Labour Party, like, I don't know if Dennis Skinner is running again, but there are people in all parties who at least stand for something. I know I'm lowering the bar. I know I'm really lowering the bar. But there are people around who really genuinely got strong views on the issues that matter to people that can be politicized in the future. Vote for them. And they could be somebody like Davis in the Conservative Party, who I don't agree with, but at least the guy stands for something, isn't just simply a cutout. What I'm really arguing for is we've got to reject all these people that both Cameron and Brown are schlepping out, all these new cohort of new candidates who are, to a person, totally useless. They are totally the kind of people that lack any of the leadership qualities that you expect of a real kind of political leader. And if necessary, I never thought I would say it, in some cases vote for a Conservative candidate. I mean, not forever. You can do it this one time, because at least it will shake things up. And the most important thing, it seems to be the most important thing, is to shake things up sufficiently so that the air can be cleared. I'm not going to say that anything that's going to emerge will be better, because there's no reason to imagine that it would, but at least the air will be cleared sufficiently so that we can begin to address some of these big issues which are really, truly important in a much more educated kind of a way.
I agree with Frank and I disagree with Frank. I think, yes, voting for people who believe in something, great, but quite frankly, Nick Griffin believes in something. I would not say vote for Nick Griffin. So my sense is, yes, this may be the election at which there's another agenda that we need to think about, and I keep coming back to this, but this election has to be about changing the structures. It has to be about opening up politics. And if that means voting for a Liberal Democrat when you're a dyed-heart Labour person, then maybe that's what you need to do, because how do you create this new energy in the next Parliament? You're not going to create it by the same ossified parties doing exactly the same thing that they've been doing for the last 20 years. It has failed us. And the reason it's failed us is because the parties themselves don't need us anymore, the way they're constituted at the moment. They don't need us because they don't have structures where they have small numbers of people in lots of places who give small amounts of money to join a party, who come together to help make policy, and it goes up through a party structure. Now that sounds really old-fashioned and it sounds really dull, but what that meant is that the political parties were always answerable to lots and lots and lots of people. Party funding means, our party funding rules mean, that one party can just rely on the trade unions and the other party can rely on individual big donors. And that means actually most of us and the ideas that we have and the energy we have and the concerns that we have, they can totally bypass. And the other thing I just wanted to disagree with, which is something Wes says, I hate to do this to you, Wes, but you said if you don't vote and you don't like the outcomes, well, you can't complain. Yes, we can. We can complain and we should complain, because quite frankly, what's on offer is really, really poor. And so we need to use our vote intelligently at this election, and then we need to complain really, really loudly.
Look, I mean, we're running a campaign at the moment which is about almost shaming out politicians to stake out their pitch on tuition fees and higher education funding, because deeply cynically, the two front benches, the Labour and the Conservative front benches, conspired to begin a tuition fees review prior to the election, which, funnily enough, reports conveniently after, which means whenever you ask any of their front bench spokespeople what their position is, they say, well, obviously, you know, this is an interesting debate, and here are the factors which are important, but of course we can't actually have a clear policy now because it would be wrong to preempt the review, which we've obviously created. So we've kind of shackled ourselves in process so we don't have to give you an honest answer. And of course, on something like this, it's not, you know, I actually hate independent reviews. If there's one thing I'd change about democracy, it would be get rid of independent reviews and royal commissions and all the rest of it. Like, you know, I think politicians need to toughen up and just say what they actually think and don't hide behind some great and the good, you know, peer or someone else who's been sort of dragged out of retirement to kind of ask some questions and come out with a technocratic solution. And that's exactly what's going on with fees. So anyway, we've got this pledge going, and, you know, we're going to collect students' email addresses, home and university postcodes, and just before the general election, we're going to email them, telling them the stance of all their local candidates on our pledge. And in doing so, we've got loads of people signing the pledge. And it's interesting from a Labour Party point of view, because you've got people who would always sign the pledge, like Diane Abbott, you know, which is finished on this week. And then you've got other people who are, by any definition, you know, die-hard Blairites and part of the new generation, despite what you read in the papers. Some of these, like, evil, hard left Unite people who are being parachuted into safe seats are actually quite hardcore Blairites, which may not make you happy, but that's kind of... And so it's really good, it's been really effective and brought lots of pressure. Would I say to students that you should only vote solely on the basis of the email we send you the week before the election? No. Because if you start to fragment and make politics too much about single issues, then you lose a sense of what kind of society it is you're trying to create and where that fits. And of course, democratic renewal is an important part of that. Of course, what kind of higher education system is part of that. But really, it's also about your ideological view, your worldview, who is best to govern. And at the forthcoming election, I actually think that economics is and remains one of the most important issues. And this is where I'm going to start shaking things up a little bit, because I think it's really easy, you know, for liberal intellectuals to sit in a room and say that New Labour's awful, and actually we shouldn't bother voting and just vote for anyone who vote on this pledge, vote on that pledge. But actually, I think Sure Start is one of the greatest achievements of the last 13 years, and I would happily take every other bad policy for that one. I don't know if anyone's ever been in a Sure Start centre, but when it comes to building and creating a much better society, if it's in kind of correcting kind of social injustice, education and Sure Start in early years is the way to do it. And these centres are fantastic, and they are popping up across the country and giving kids in some of the poorest communities a massive opportunity. And there are other examples as well. There are all sorts of legislative achievements as well that I think we've seen. And all I'd say is that, you know, and going back to the point that was made slightly back, you know, Tony Blair did something that he thought was right on Iraq. I didn't agree with it, and I'm sure most of you didn't either. But, you know, there have been signs of kind of tough leadership. We complain then and we complain now, but the point is that you do have to go into the election with a worldview, with an ideological outlook, and fight to change the system. And I would argue, as much as, you know, New Labour gets bashed, there are many reasons why this country is a fairer place as a result of it. And actually, if you just say let the other lot in because it's their term and they need, you know, New Labour need a kick up the backside, it probably won't be people in this room that suffer. It'll be people in some of Britain's poorest communities whose interests have been well served, I think, by 13 years of Labour government.
The one thing we have to do is actually combat cynicism in the short run. That's the short-run task, which is to make people understand that cynicism is an act of despair that can only have very negative consequences. There's also a long-term task, which I think we need to engage with, which is how we move from a pre-political situation to a political one. And one of the ways you can do that is by talking the language of politics. One of the reasons why I feel the way that I do is that actually, on all the big issues of the day, I fail to see any differences. I mean, West mentions early intervention. You know, early intervention, Tories are signed up to it, the Lib Dems are signed up to it, New Labour is signed up to it. I think it's a horrible idea. I think it's one of the biggest mistakes that we're making in terms of childcare, in terms of engaging with kind of communities who are on the edge and elsewhere. And it doesn't work. We also forget the fact that the originators of early intervention and of Sure Start was the Bush regime in the United States. And I don't think that's a coincidence that this is where it all began and where all the research into it was financed by that particular regime, because essentially it's all about how you run people's life for them. It's the most paternalistic, infantilizing intervention that we have. And I'm open to debating it. I'm open to arguing with people about it. But is there a debate on early intervention? Is there a debate on... There isn't. And the reason why there isn't is because the political oligarchy in our society has entirely signed up to that. Anything technical, anything technocratic, anything that's evidence-based, is fine. We don't have to talk about what's good and bad. And it seems to me that what we have to do is to take these ideas, which are beyond discussion, which are beyond debate, and really expose them to rigorous Socratic, sort of arguments, and to demonstrate that at the end of the day they actually evade confronting the real issues and actually do a disservice to the working class communities and to poor in this country.
The idea of bringing in suffragettes is that years ago, when I used to go canvassing in Hackney, and when you said to older people, you'd knock on the door and a pensioner would answer the door, female pensioners, and you said, "Are you going to vote?" And they were offended by the question, because to them voting was absolutely essential. The idea that you wouldn't vote was, they perhaps not them personally, but the suffragettes had fought for it, and they couldn't conceive of not going out and voting. And I think that's one of the things that's happened. It's not only with young people who are 2 or 3 generations down the track, but even middle-aged people don't see that connect. Finally, on this business about whether the campaign to clean up politics has been bad for politics. Well, it clearly has been bad for politics, and I think that politicians bear the blame for that. I'm not blaming. I think the media's been too one-sided over it. There has been a lasting, certainly in the medium term, lasting damage done to politics, and I'm not sure how it's going to get out of it.